Tonight I'm going to cover a video that I planned on covering sooner, however, didn't get around to until now. It's Nina's commentary on me, along with Copycat and Keyblade Master, albeit I'll primarily be focusing on the points about myself. By the way, if you see Nina change avatars throughout this video, that's because she uses a different one for each degree. I'll just let her explain.
I would also like to note that while Ephraim is the main focus of this commentary, I do have points against Copycat and Key, in which case I'll be switching my avatar to Princess Zelda and Taya Gardner respectively.
Also, she uses a completely different backgrounded avatar for post points, which I will be showing some of. This is a video which I pointed out several issues with while checking the script for, and have since found several more in the final product. Let's get into this.
On September 3, 2021, a countdown maker by the name of Copycat released a video titled, "The Worst Thing About Every Nintendo Franchise," where he would talk about what he thought to be the worst things about every Nintendo franchise. Well, not every single franchise. I guess Chibi Robo, Custom Robo and Golden Sun and the rest of the franchises listed here are perfect in his eyes.
Nina, Copycat covered several of the franchises shown in this picture. You even play clips of him discussing some of them. Just looking at the top row, immediately Fire Emblem, Yoshi, and Kirby are all listed despite the fact those have segments again discussed in your commentary.
Next franchise we're going to look at in this video is the turn-based style Fire Emblem series.
And although I haven't played many of its games, when I have, the worst part about them has to be the Fog of War levels. What this means is that you have a limited vision of the map, making it impossible to properly predict where to go, and ensuring that you're going to fail several times like I always would. What I hated the most about these levels was the AI, as they are incredibly unpredictable, so there would be playthroughs where you need to guide someone from point A to point B, and they die before you even reach them. Although I really don't have anything against the Yoshi franchise, there's one standout thing about the games that I absolutely hate, and that's its easy difficulty. Other than Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island for the SNES, I feel like I haven't had any trouble with any of the titles since that entry, where it almost seems like Nintendo is intentionally producing them for kids as a stepping stone to other franchises. As a fan of increased difficulty in video games, I would like to see an entry more like the old Yoshi Island titles, but if Crafted World is any indication, then I don't think that will ever happen. Next franchise we're going to focus on is Kirby's, where the worst thing about his series is that it's starting to become stale and repetitive. To date, there are 17 platforming games starring the titular character, with the last being Star Allies that came out for the Switch in 2018. Although there were a few interesting concepts in that game, like its multiplayer mode, during my playthrough I felt like I already had a similar experience in past titles, and it didn't seem like anything new happened at all. Another reason why Kirby games have felt stale is because they stopped making spin-off titles that I always remember amounted to extremely fun gameplay. The last one of these was Kirby's Air Ride for the GameCube, which was a very underrated racing title that unfortunately was overshadowed by Mario Kart and F-Zero at the time.
Immediately after the Yoshi segment, by the way, is Star Fox, which again is on this graphic for some reason, even though, no, he doesn't think it's perfect.
One of the most disappointing franchises that you're going to see in this video is the rail shoot-'em-up Star Fox series, as the most recent entries have fallen so flat that it almost needs a complete reimagining. The last one to be released was Star Fox Zero for the failed Wii U console, which when it came out was met with heavy criticism as it oddly separated the flying and shooting and put them on separate screens, which led to incredibly awkward moments that just didn't feel natural. Star Fox entries as a whole have just gotten a lot worse since its earlier days, and I hope that it can return to its glory if they decide to make another one.
And also Mario and Metroid. Those similarly fall under these aforementioned categories.
Starting things off with Nintendo's first franchise they debuted on the NES in 1985, Mario, where I'd have to say that the worst thing about this series of games is that when they do include a multiplayer mode, it almost always is underwhelming. Even though it's a final focus of games like Super Mario 3D World and the new Super Mario Bros. Console entries, it always felt cumbersome to have 4 separate characters on screen at one time, as it forces players to stay together rather than explore on their own. This reluctance for each player to possess their own split screen has always led to frustrating moments with my friends and I, as it was inevitable that someone would lag behind. The chaos that's caused from this can be fun, but it does greatly diminish the point of co-op play, as it becomes more entertaining to troll your party rather than to help them.
More recently in Super Mario Odyssey and in Bowser's Fury, the co-op has involved the second player controlling the game's ancillary characters, like Happy and Bowser Jr., only helping the first player by collecting items and easily defeating enemies. Although this method of co-op works on some levels, especially if you're playing with a person that's new to video games, it does however make your experience incredibly easy, taking any risk away that makes the playthrough more rewarding.
To be honest, this is a small problem in a series that's usually directed towards a single-player experience. I just find it a bit unfortunate because if a multiplayer was done right, it would be a huge hit. Next franchise released in order is Metroid, where diehard fans will agree with me that the worst thing about the series has to be the fact that there's been such an enormous gap between home console Prime entries. If you don't count Metroid Other M, which I don't really as it was developed by Team Ninja and not Retro Studios, making it feel different. The last Prime game came out in 2007, which was 3 generations of consoles ago.
Also, under what definition is Devil World a franchise? It had a single game in the late 80s that itself was not exported to North America until 2023, primarily due to concerns that its religious imagery would offend those in said region. which I think we all agree with Pat the NES punk on.
This is just silly. I mean, how dumb is it to think that anyone would be offended by the religious overtones in this game, or influenced by it religiously? Excuse you for a minute. What a stupid notion thinking this game would influence people. It's a green dragon eating ice cream cones!
Also, Advance Wars is a series within the Nintendo Wars franchise. It itself is not a franchise. I want to open by talking about his title. Nitpicks are complaints now, which, yeah, they are. Nitpicks, by definition, are valid criticisms over things that don't actually matter in the grand scheme of the product. For example, if I complained about a small typo in a book that did not stop me from understanding the sentence where the typo was present, that would be nitpicking. The typo exists, and I'm right to point out that the typo exists, but it has no actual impact on the overall quality of the book in question.
Quick question. Where did you get the idea that nitpicks are, quote unquote, inherently valid? I ask you that because I was looking up the definition of nitpick, and nowhere in my search did I find a definition that said that nitpicks are inherently valid. The definition of nitpicking describes it as giving too much attention to details that are not important.
Yes, details, things that exist within the product. How exactly would you be able to determine how important a detail is if said detail wasn't real? Go back to my typo example. You can have even incredibly minor typographical errors which end up completely changing the meaning of a sentence. Grammarly even has an article noting that a small mistake regarding your punctuation could make you sound like a cannibal. However, in order to discuss the severity of such a typo, we would have to have a mutual agreement that said typo is present. Otherwise, what would we even be discussing the severity of? Essentially, even if you want to argue that this definition does not explicitly say nitpicks are inherently valid, that is something which can be easily inferred from the definition itself.
So unless I'm missing something, then wherever you found this definition of nitpick is faulty. And if by off chance this was self-made, then it wasn't well thought out, since it makes nitpicks seem like they're always correct when nitpicks can still be criticized if the information surrounding them is faulty.
But at that point, you're not even discussing a detail that's minor. You're just saying something that's factually incorrect. I'm confused as to what the disconnect here is, primarily because fundamentally we already have terms in the English language to communicate the idea of something being the opposite of true. Nitpick is not used to express that idea and is instead mentioned in reference to things that are true but utterly insignificant. If somebody says the Earth is a sphere and I respond by saying that's incorrect, it's an oblate spheroid, I'm nitpicking. What I'm saying is, for all intents and purposes, completely correct, minus a handful of highly specific ones the average person is incredibly unlikely to come across. However, it's such a small distinction that fundamentally it doesn't really matter. However, if I say the Earth is flat, that is just me being wrong in a way that is substantially different from if the original claim was correct. See this article, What Would Happen If the Earth Were Actually Flat, which points out several things ranging from GPS to gravity itself that would not exist if the planet were flat. If this is somewhat confusing to the viewer, then allow me to put it like this. The famous writer Isaac Asimov wrote an essay called The Relativity of Wrong, in which he discusses various incorrect ideas throughout all of history, including the shape of the Earth, funnily enough, and points out how, even if all generations were incorrect, there's a fundamental difference in how incorrect they were. There's a difference between somebody who thinks the Earth is flat and somebody who thinks the world is a perfect sphere, even if both of those beliefs are incorrect. Similarly, to use another example from the essay, there's a difference between thinking 2 plus 2 is 3.9 repeating and thinking it's purple. Nitpicking is pointing out an error that has such a low relativity of wrong that for all intents and purposes, the statement being criticized might as well be correct. If that correction is incorrect, then you're no longer nitpicking, you're just being incorrect.
In regards to how I got to the conclusion that nitpicks are inherently valid, that's because if a criticism is invalid, we don't call that nitpicking, we call that being wrong, which is a totally different issue altogether. This is especially the case in how Key was using it, as he titled the video "Nitpicks are complaints" and therefore implied the issues were minor. However, minor issues are still issues. Also, if nitpicks can be criticized, then the criticism is just incorrect. We separate these concepts when it comes to argumentation.
To address the first part of your comment, sure, I guess I can agree that nitpick are complaints and can still be valid. However, that wouldn't inherently defeat how saying that nitpicks are valid inherently, meaning always, is wrong.
Except that's not what I fucking said. What I directly commented was that these concepts are separated, hence why we use a different word to describe things that are incorrect than we do things that are nitpicks.
And we don't have to separate these concepts when it comes to argumentation. Surprisingly, both can coexist. If the information itself is nitpicky, it is still nitpicky information whether it is correct or not.
First off, we actually do need to separate them if we want to be able to properly communicate exactly what it is we're discussing in the first place. Criticizing somebody for nitpicking is not going to be the same as criticizing them for being incorrect, for the same reason criticizing somebody for being anything except incorrect is different from criticizing somebody for being incorrect. You don't actually provide anything resembling an argument here. Instead, you just gesture towards a hypothetical, which, okay, give me an example then. Seriously, find me something that is both not a detail and an insignificant detail. I would be really interested, Nina. Also, how exactly could information itself be nitpicky? Nitpicks are a form of argumentation. Information is just information. If I say the world is an oblate spheroid in a vacuum, am I nitpicking? Well, no, because I'm not responding to anything. I'm just stating a fact. If I say that to somebody who says the earth is flat, I am similarly not nitpicking because that is an incredibly different worldview than the one that is being presented in opposition to my statement. However, if I say that to somebody saying the world is a perfect sphere, that is nitpicking because, again, that is really, for all intents and purposes, a distinction without a meaningful difference.
Let's start this commentary off with a story. So I was watching Braillecourt's commentary on a guy named Copycat, and after seeing it, I decided to check out Copycat's channel, where I found this video. And the moment I saw this tasteless title, I knew a commentary was in order.
Quick question, how is the title tasteless exactly? I'll give you I don't find trigger jokes to be all that funny or original, but considering he's clearly using the word in reference to things that make me angry, which is how the word triggered has been used in online discourse for multiple years, I fail to see how it could be considered tasteless, unless there's some additional context I'm not aware of, but you don't explain it in the slightest. You just say it and expect us all to understand why that is.
You know, as soon as I got to this point, I knew I had good material for me to cover. The reason why the term triggered is considered tasteless is because it is mainly associated with PTSD, alongside how the word triggered is generally used to refer to its actual definition and not just another word for anger.
Both would be actual definitions if they accurately describe how the word is being used. And by the way, I actually checked the definition of triggered, and it could include both intense hyperbolic reactions and somebody experiencing the intense emotional episodes you are discussing. Specifically according to Merriam-Webster, which defines the word triggered as either occurring in response to a stimulus typically perceived as negative or harmful, or caused to feel an intense and usually negative emotional reaction affected by an emotional trigger.
So using the word in the fashion that Copycat did can be seen as rather off-putting at best and tasteless at worst than it would have been back in 2015 or 2016 when that was the norm back then.
Do you have any evidence the word triggered is more used in the context you are discussing compared to the ones that I am? Because if not, then you haven't debunked anything I said. You just asserted something. And as for what it's associated with, that's going to be very dependent on the individual. A person who's primarily familiar with the term, because of Nathaniel Bandy's old Triggers You videos, for example, would not associate the concept of being triggered with post-traumatic stress disorder, but instead might be reminded of seeing him complain about video games in a hyperbolic manner.
When you're 5 years old, don't know what you're doing, and you run into the first Goomba. So I just beat Bowser, but instead of a princess, there's this mushroom guy saying she's in another castle. Are you freaking kidding me? This game is way too easy. The jumping mechanics are innovative but feel clunky. It takes too long to build up speed. You can't go backwards in a level. Mario only has one type of move, and that's jumping. When you get hit with a fire flower, you downgrade all the way to Small Mario. And speaking of power-ups, we only have 3.
And by the way, I sat down and read the article you cite here. It directly notes the term triggered had grown to mean something less severe in common parlance. And even says conflating the two concepts is genuinely harmful to people with things like post-traumatic stress disorder. The more casual use of trigger warnings usually comes from a good place, but it can sometimes have an unintentionally negative impact for people dealing with trauma. For example, it's led some folks to believe that people who need trigger warnings are overly sensitive, fragile, or incapable of coping with distress. People may also say they are triggered without a true understanding of what being triggered involves. But wait a minute, doesn't that inherently mean the casual definition does have a very strong presence in regular discourse if it's genuinely causing people to grow an impression on what it means to use the word itself in other contexts? Now, if Key were to have mentioned something like that and then called the title tasteless on that basis, then we'd be having a different conversation. However, he didn't mention any of this. He just assumed it was self-evidently the case when I didn't believe it was, because of my own subjective understanding of what the word has usually meant in the spaces I've been in. And now you get my overall point. Regarding if this is tasteless or not, that's a subjective matter I can't prove or disprove. However, I can say that subjectively, I don't think it is, provide some reasoning, and then make it clear I could be convinced otherwise if the right information was shown to me. However, Key didn't. He just said it. And you go on to find this agreeable, by the way.
Now that being said, I do agree that Key should have explained this in more detail on why that's an issue. Hey Key, you can't just say that something is a problem without explaining why or how it is a problem in the first place. When you claim that something is an issue or a problem, you're supposed to prove how that's the case and explain why what Copycat did was off-putting or tasteless. Otherwise, this point would practically amount to, this is an issue because I said so. Which is the worst argument to make since not every issue speaks for itself.
The only thing we can even really disagree on regarding this topic is how the word triggered is typically used. And if I was incorrect about that, then a correction would be fine, but you don't debunk that point at all.
Not specifically, it's more associated with strong emotional reactions as a result of negative stimulus, although obviously PTSD can be related to that. I'm in multiple servers with trigger chats. People who post there aren't automatically saying they have PTSD.
PTSD is the thing most heavily associated with triggers though. It's why people get mad when people make trigger jokes and shit like that.
And you know that how exactly? Are you ever going to get around to providing evidence to back up these claims?
Also, chances are that it's likely that they're putting something that has traumatized them in there. Plus, when someone says something legitimately triggers them, they're saying that very thing, that it's something that triggers a trauma response.
How have you determined this? Your entire point is based off of one giant assumption on your part that you have done absolutely nothing to properly back up. At absolute most, you've proven it is used in the context being discussed, but that's not something I ever denied.
Okay, first off, saying Animal Crossing has a lack of a story is really funny, considering within the most recent installment, there is technically a small story there via building up your island and its ratings until KK Slider shows up.
Ignoring how a small story doesn't do anything to Copycat's point about the lack of story in the Animal Crossing series, the worst thing about the Animal Crossing series for him isn't even the lack of the story. The worst thing about the series is its repetitiveness.
Next up is the Animal Crossing franchise, where I'd have to say that the worst thing about the series is its repetitiveness, as after a few hours of gameplay, I felt like I ran out of things to do.
The lack of story isn't big enough of a problem to have its segment, nor is this the central point he's making. What the hell, Key?
But Key very clearly didn't say Copycat called lack of story within Animal Crossing the worst thing about it as a franchise. He was just making the point that Copycat was accusing the series of lacking a story, which he was. He literally played B-roll of Animal Crossing while saying,
Whether it be a lack of story,
Similarly, immediately after this, he goes on to say,
terrible levels,
while showing footage of the infamous water temple from Ocarina of Time, using it as shorthand to communicate an example of a terrible level, given it's widely seen as exactly that.
Personally, from an experience viewpoint, I don't find the temples in this game to be that challenging. I do, however, find a number of them to be quite long. I'm not sure whether or not it's because of the 3D shift or people complaining that the dungeons just weren't long enough in the previous games, where there are some dungeons in this game that just never seem to end. Yes, I'm talking about the goddamn Water Temple, which for years has been the cause of despair for many players. The reason why the Water Temple gets so much shit from a lot of people that have played this game is not just because of the constant need to raise or lower the water levels to get to new locations, but the need to constantly pause the game and switch to the iron boost to walk underwater. You know what really aggravates me about this temple though? You know when you're trying to solve a puzzle and you spend so long looking for the solution, and then when you finally find it, you slap yourself in the forehead for not realizing it earlier? This place is chock full of that kind of shit, and it pisses me off. I just can't for the life of me remember the fastest method of completing this place. And why can't I use nothing but my hookshot underwater? Or better yet, why can't I just fucking swim? Mario can do it. I'm sure Link can do it too.
Number 6. The Water Temple, Ocarina of Time. What? Jaywitz, how can you have the Water Temple at number 6? It is clearly the worst temple of all time. Have you not read the memes? Oh, don't worry, I still don't like the Water Temple, but after playing through this temple around 20 plus times over the course of my life, I think my hatred has been dulled just a little. The biggest problem with what I actually think is a cool level design with awesome atmosphere is that it's just so boring. You know the drill. Raise the water and lower the water by playing a song on your ocarina a dozen plus times. Drop into the sea with your iron boots through the pause menu. Select, unpause, oh wait, I need to swim now, so pause, turn the boots off, unpause, and oh, now we need to put them back on to get back on the floor, so boots back on, pause, boots, oh. I think at face value, there are potentially good puzzles here. But good Goddesses of the Triforce, it is one of the slowest and most tedious ways to present some good puzzles. The absolute worst part is the key. Everybody's got that one key that you always forget to grab. Mine's this one right here. But the dungeon's design doesn't let you know that you're missing a key until you're in way too deep. It's not the worst dungeon ever, but it might be the worst dungeon ever to backtrack, forcing you to lower and raise water as you trek through every corner of the place just to figure out where you were supposed to go first. The 3DS version very thankfully gave us the ability to equip the iron boots as a sea item, which might be why I haven't been as enraged in my last few visits to Waterworld. They also give you color-coordinated doors to the water levels, which I'm not even sure was needed. But ultimately, even those fixes can't save the fact that this dungeon bores me to tears.
Notice how both of these videos express that the level is already infamous, by the way, with Jaywiz even saying, if anything, he dislikes it less than the average gamer. However, the actual segment on Zelda has no mention whatsoever of the Water Temple. Instead, it points out that you never play as Zelda in the Zelda franchise.
Nintendo's next big franchise in their storied history is the Legend of Zelda series, which quite honestly is near perfect, as it contains some of the most in-depth and intricate entries ever created. However, if I did have to pick one thing about the games to complain about, It's that the titular character is almost never a playable option, barely showing up until she's needed to be saved, or even in some instances, isn't present in the specific game at all. As a kid, I always remember the title confusing me, as I couldn't quite understand why a secondary character would be picked over the main character Link. And in comparison, it'd be like calling the Mario series Peach, which of course doesn't make sense. Over the years, I've definitely grown to like and accept the Zelda title, and honestly it is a testament to how good this franchise is, if it isn't my only complaint. I do hope though that Zelda will take a larger role in the franchise eventually, but only time will tell what they'll do in Breath of the Wild 2.
That doesn't mean he's not calling the Water Temple a terrible level, though. I mean, it would have to be quite the coincidence for him to be picking such an infamous level for B-roll footage while using the phrase terrible levels. And to further back up the point that these are still claims he is making, regardless of if he says they're the worst in the franchise, his last example in this little montage is saying the games are too easy while showing footage of a Pokemon game.
Or the entries being way too easy.
Which does go on to be his biggest complaint with the franchise.
Next up, we're going to look at the massively popular Pokemon franchise, where I'd have to say that the worst thing about it has to be the steady decrease in difficulty that could be seen in its newer titles. This was pretty much the main complaint of their most recent Pokemon Sword and Shield entries, as there never really was a point in the game where you felt like you were in trouble, especially as the XP share works almost too well in leveling up your entire party at once. This causes you to be several levels higher than every opponent you come across, and just makes what should at least be a bit of a challenge incredibly easy.
This is made worse by the fact the story you do describe is less an overarching plot and more a general background for the setting the game takes place in. To give an example of what I'm talking about, the original Super Mario Bros. Had the plot of save Princess Toadstool from King Koopa, as they were both called at the time. However, it would still be accurate to say the first Super Mario Bros. Lacks a plot because it doesn't have some kind of overarching narrative that changes throughout the game. It has a static goal, that is, get to the end, and there's some background to justify why you are doing this. It's the same thing with this Animal Crossing game you're talking about.
To an extent, I understand this point, and it's not wrong, because the Animal Crossing games had a story that served as the background for the world. However, an overarching plot isn't something you just apply to any story, especially in life simulation games. Life simulation games are about maintaining and growing a virtual life, where players are given the power to control the lives of autonomous people or creatures.
How do you control something that's autonomous?
You only need an overarching plot in most JRPGs, Fire Emblem, Golden Sun, Xenoblade, etc. Look, as much as I agree that Animal Crossing suffers from a lack of story, an overarching plot isn't something you can just apply in a life simulation game. If you just focused on the first part and scrapped the second part, I wouldn't be here making this interjection. Yet, here we are.
Nothing that you said here disproved my point, that being Keyblade misunderstood what Copycat meant by lack of story. You also fail to explain why it's such an absurd concept for a life simulator to have an overarching narrative, and instead you just define what a life simulator is, as if that inherently makes the concept of a video game with said overarching narrative an antonym to its very definition, but it doesn't appear to be one. Also, who's to say JRPGs in particular need one? Well, apparently not you, given you only say that most need them, but which ones don't, and why that genre in particular? And who's talking about what the game itself needs? What do you mean by that? Do you mean as in it needs it in order to be of quality? It needs it in order to be the best it can? It needs it in order for the game to actually work on a fundamental level? This point is full of so many unsubstantiated claims that I genuinely don't know what to make of it, honestly. And even if it were all correct, at absolute most it would refute what Copycat said. But I'm not Copycat. So what does that have to do with my point?
And secondly, this outline doesn't do a good job on giving the audience a good understanding of this list, since from the way you structure this part and your very tasteless title for this video, it makes this video come off as if you're pointing out the objective worst things about these franchises.
What? What? I don't get you. What about his presentation so far has made you think this was some kind of objective list?
Perhaps there are 3 reasons why Key feels this way.
Yeah, the fact that you feel the need to speculate as to why this is proves my point that Key failed to elaborate on this properly. Show me him saying this, or else you're just saying, well, it could be because of that, but that wasn't the problem.
Hey, Copycat never stated that he would be subjective on his list. While yes, you don't always have to state that a list will be subjective, if other factors make the list seem objective, it would be best to state that it'll be subjective to not cause any confusion here.
Okay, small problem with your structuring, you shouldn't have put this first. What you're saying essentially boils down to, you wouldn't believe this is evidence on its own, however other factors have caused you to think it is relevant. But you haven't introduced those yet. You should have said what caused you to have this impression in the first place before mentioning something that he should have included because he had already given his audience this impression through other means, essentially.
Even looking at the title you showed, what triggers people, either in the psychological context or the internet discussion context, is subjective and is going to vary from person to person. Again, unless there's something I'm missing, in which case, well, you can guess what the issue is.
In what way is the title subjective? It's written in a third-person sort of way of why each Nintendo franchise upsets you.
That's second person, not third person.
Starting things off with Nintendo's first franchise they debuted on the NES in 1985, Mario. Where I'd have to say that the worst thing about this series of games is that when they do include a multiplayer mode, it almost always is underwhelming. Even though it's a final focus of games like Super Mario 3D World and the new Super Mario Bros. Console entries, it always felt cumbersome to have 4 separate characters on screen at one time, as it forces players to stay together rather than explore on their own.
So you find it cumbersome for the players to stick together as opposed to exploring on their own.
Yes, that is quite literally what he just said. Yeah, this is something else this guy likes to do quite a bit. He occasionally just starts his interjections with things we just heard the person he's commentating on say. I'll be cutting these out unless he screws something up during them, but I just wanted to include one to make the point that it makes him look redundant and waste the time of his audience.
So, going off what you said here, how does repeating someone else's words make them appear redundant?
Because that's what the word redundant means, Nina. It is exceeding what is necessary or normal, characterized by or containing an excess, and characterized by similarity or repetition. In this case, similarity to what Copycat just said, and repetition in that it was a point Copycat already made being repeated. That's 3 different definitions of redundant that it falls under. What exactly is the problem here?
And this is why elaboration is necessary. Seriously, you're not explaining why or how it's redundant, just that it is, somehow. The burden of proof is on you, and the least you can do is elaborate on how or why it's redundant to strengthen your case. Otherwise, we can't take your word for it.
But my case had already been proven. I played Copycat saying something, and then played Key saying the exact same thing. I'm confused as to what more would even be required to make such a statement, and you do nothing to explain the threshold for evidence you are looking for, which is more than a little hypocritical given you just got onto Key for not elaborating on a point properly, because he failed to offer a constructive solution to fix the issue being discussed.
Yet spoilers, some of the entries on this list have Copycat speaking about his personal experiences with these franchises.
As a kid, I always remembered the title confusing me, as I couldn't quite understand why a secondary character would be picked over the main character Link.
Honestly, if you wanted this list to be about the worst things in your eyes about these franchises, then you have the right to do so. Just please don't try to make this come off like it's an objective list when it's not.
So there's no solution to how Copycat should have indicated that this list will be opinionated. Nothing? Okay then.
But you offer absolutely no constructive solution for how I could have better elaborated on the point you discussed. It's genuinely just explain it better. Okay, what aspect of it did I not explain properly in the first place? Now later on, Nina does basically do the same interjection and even mentions that it would have been a more appropriate time for me to call Key redundant. So we can assume this is what she would have actually preferred over my approach. So let's cut to that real quick.
And for Super Mario 3D World, while the levels in that game might have a Y-axis in them, their structure is still very straightforward considering it's just a pathway to the goal.
So, it's basically the same point you just made about the level design, but without the 2D element. Hey, you're aware that repeating what you just said makes you look redundant, right? I mean, it is just the things we've heard before. And I want to make this clear for Ephraim. This right here is redundant. Summarizing Copycat's point for the sake of laying the groundwork for Key's point is not redundant.
Wait a minute, is the issue that my understanding of redundancy is flawed, or that I didn't explain the point well enough? Because those are very different critiques. And your comment at the end about Key not being redundant originally makes it sound like you believe the first one is the case, but your entire criticism was based around the second one. I'm really confused right now. What fundamentally separates what you said from what I said outside of the context it was said in? And again, if that is your problem, you should have opened with that originally as opposed to making it a point about elaboration.
Despite the fact that in the new Super Mario Bros. Games, the levels are very straightforward, with the level design being a straight line due to those games being 2D.
I'm skipping past a decent point on Nina's part in response to what Key said.
So, just because a game is linear and two-dimensional, that doesn't mean the game is unable to have explorative aspects. The classic Sonic series, for example, are linear games, but the games do reward you for stopping and exploring your surroundings. Sonic 3 & Knuckles, for example, has giant rings hidden throughout the level, which will take you to special stages where you can earn the Chaos and later Super Emerald. Which, I should note, you need to do if you want to get the best ending in the game.
Hey, you do realize we're not even on the part about exploration, right? Although it's a part of his complaint, it's not what we're discussing. Copycat's primary point was the feeling of being cumbersome to have 4 players on screen. Key then points out that the game's 2D nature doesn't make it cumbersome. Which is wrong, but I digress. I feel like this point should be moved towards the point where Key actually talks about explorations later on. I'll let you know when you could have interjected.
Where exactly did Key do anything to make this distinction? His mention of linearity clearly implies that he is at the very least taking on both notions at the same time, if only because it makes no sense to mention how linear a game is in the context of it being cumbersome. But it does make perfect sense, assuming you're talking about if you're allowed to explore in the game. You provide nothing that Key said which would indicate this distinction exists, so again, it seems like you're just making an assumption without any real basis.
It forces players to stay together as opposed to exploring on their own. Copycat, just before Key cut away. Exploration was mentioned on the part, and Key even mentions exploration in his recap of Copycat's point.
Except that Key was summarizing Copycat's point to lay the groundwork for his point, but that doesn't mean he was immediately going to talk about explorations. Let's say that person A complained about Makoto Kino's character design and brought up her being a tough tomboy as an addition. I'd then summarize person A's point and then argue against it, but would then argue the tomboy part separately later. Although Makoto being a tomboy was mentioned in a part of person A's complaint, it's not what we're discussing currently.
I'm not denying such a structure is impossible, however, you still have to provide to me some reason why I should believe Key was doing that. If he had began the point I was responding to by going, to respond to what you said about the game being cumbersome for starters, I would at the very least understand this point, because that would be Key clearly indicating he is not discussing the entirety of the topic being mentioned at that particular moment. However, that's not what happened. He just jumped straight into this without doing anything to imply exactly what you're currently talking about.
Hell, the picture of New Super Mario Bros. Wii that you put on screen is from level 1-3, which has a secret exit that, if gotten, will take the player to a warp cannon where they can skip to World 5. That is a perfect example of encouraging exploration in an otherwise linear game. Oh, and by the way, warp zones are something the Mario series has been doing since literally their first game on the NES. Just wanted to remind everyone.
Okay, before I go on to explain the rest of the point, I'd like to thank Jack Lockstyle for pointing out something about the Sonic example Ephraim used. His issue carries over to the next point about warp zones, which is why I included his comment here. The comparison from Sonic's special stage rings from Sonic 3 and Knuckles to those warp zones in New Super Mario Bros. Is faulty. The latter is used to skip segments of the game to a certain worlds, whereas the former, after you use them, keeps you in the same spot of the level. The warp zones are optional, but they function completely differently progression-wise.
Nina, I wasn't comparing the two things. They were two different examples to communicate the same general point. That being, you can have exploratory aspects in 2D, otherwise linear games. At most, I said they had one underlying similarity, which, yeah, they do. Do you have any reason for me to believe that isn't the case? If so, are you going to present it?
Those special stages are used to get the good ending, yes, but some to most players are only just wanting to complete the levels normally. It's not so much as a reward, and more so a necessity to get that ending, which I do not think those warp zones in Mario are needed for a certain criteria for completion, but details.
How does that in any way disprove what I said? Yes, the rewards are different, however, fundamentally, you are still getting some kind of reward. In the case of Mario, that's the ability to skip to later levels without needing to beat the ones you normally would have to if you wanted to get to that point. And in the case of Sonic, it's a better ending, along with an unlockable, invincible super and later hyper form. Also, how exactly does a better ending not qualify as a reward? It is a thing given to you because you have done something good, worked hard, etc. In this case, you explored the levels and earned all of the Chaos and Super Emeralds. You try to draw this weird dichotomy between what it is and a reward, which just doesn't appear to actually exist. I would also like some data for your most players point. I'm not even saying it's wrong, I would just like some evidence. And I'd recommend not saying an unsubstantiated claim like that just before you get on to me for not properly providing proof for a specific claim I made. Genuinely, this is the next thing Nina says.
Anyway. Yes, warp zones, which is not something you're going to show apparently. Seriously, you don't show any footage or pictures of warp zones being a thing since the beginning, and you don't cite any sources in your description.
Now, I do actually agree with Nina's claim here that I should have backed up my point better than I originally did, and regret the fact I tried to defend not doing such when I checked the script for this commentary. However, Nina also made note that I didn't need a source for everything, which I similarly pointed out, and I have an issue with what she said in response.
On one hand, I'm not unwilling to admit that I should have done that. On the other, and this is a genuine question, isn't that one of the most famous screens in all of gaming? Like, did anybody not know what I was talking about without the visual aid? This is why I don't get your point above. You're not saying everything requires a source, but I do need a source for a claim as well known as the original Super Mario Bros. Has warp zones in it.
Honestly, your excuse of the sources being common knowledge is quite flimsy. Not only for the reasons I already mentioned in my main point, but also because what might be well known to you, could be unfamiliar to others. Also, when I said that you aren't required to provide citations for every single claim you make, I was primarily alluding to more evident observations or a no-shit statement, such as the color of the sky being blue or the grass appearing green.
Well, who's to say those are inherently obvious? I mean, they are to us, but I can think of groups of people that would not be apparent to. Somebody who is born blind, for example, is not going to know what color anything is because they're unable to see. Honestly, if you had just said I should have provided a citation, that would have been perfectly fine. However, you trying to include this caveat is utterly nonsensical, if only because you're right. What's common knowledge is totally subjective, so therefore demanding that I provide a citation unless something meets this entirely subjective criteria is utter nonsense. In my view, what I stated was common knowledge. You disagree. Again, that's fine, but it shows a disconnect here that inherently makes the concept of common knowledge a non-useful one.
Despite the fact that in both of those games, there are rewards and punishments depending on how the players work together with each other. As in the new Super Mario Bros. Games and Super Mario 3D World, they have a bubble gimmick to where if the player is about to die, then they can enter a bubble that can only be popped by the other players, thus saving that player from losing a life and encouraging teamwork.
Yeah, it's also a mechanic that can be abused and misused in a number of ways. For example, players can bubble in order to avoid having to overcome any of the challenges the game throws at them. For that matter, if every player enters a bubble, it's basically seen as the same as everyone dying, which, again, can create a number of issues considering that would essentially kick everyone out of the stage.
Wouldn't this issue fall onto those people for misusing the bubble rather than the bubble itself, though? Like, wouldn't that be an issue with the usage of the tool rather than the tool itself? Don't know what I mean by this? Well, allow me to put an analogy. Let's use a car as an example. A car allows us to travel to work, school, and other destinations quickly and efficiently, but the car can also be used to either A, run over people, or B, crash another car. But would that be the fault of the car itself? Or would that be the fault of the person driving the car? The fault falls onto the driver using the car, because the car itself is meant to travel around other destinations quickly and efficiently, and the person misusing the car wouldn't change that. Yes, there are rules in place to lessen these acts from happening. However, that's not 100% of the time going to stop people from committing those illegal acts.
Nina, you do know car manufacturers can be punished for people expressing their individual autonomy in a way that causes direct harm to others while using a car, right? To quote from the book Bad Law, victims of drunk drivers cannot normally turn around and sue the makers of the car that was being operated illegally by the drunk, though in some cases they can sue the bar that served the drunk who later drove. But automakers cannot encourage drunk driving. They can't market their cars as containing lane assists for drunks trying to make it home after closing time without attracting the attention of traffic cops. They can't turn the steering column into a flask with a straw attachment so drivers can suck out orange juice or whiskey on their way home from work. And if they did any of those things, they'd be sued by the victims of drunk drivers. And the automaker's defense, actually the steering flask was for juice, it's not our fault that somebody put Jack Daniels in it, would legally fail. Drinking and driving is fundamentally an individual choice. However, we as a society agree it should be made difficult to do at the very least. And that's only assuming we're specifically limiting it to court litigation, by the way. Insurance industries serve as a similar check, and they will blame car manufacturers if a particular vehicle is unsafe. To quote from the same book, of course, insurance is its own form of regulation. Put a pin in this point, I will return to it later. I won't though, so you don't actually have to. A car maker that marketed an unsafe car prone to accidents or marketed a car specifically for people interested in committing crimes with the vehicle would quickly find that their car was uninsurable and thus functionally unobtainable by most of the market. It is more difficult, read expensive, to get insurance for certain makes and models of cars. Sports cars generally are harder to insure because they go fast. If an auto company ever marketed a car that promised to make drinking and driving easier, the insurance companies would eat the car alive before it saw the inside of a Kelley Blue Book.
It's the same thing with the bubble. It wouldn't take away from how the bubble's intended use as a tool meant for strengthening cooperation, as it's meant to save people from dying via the bubble that can only be popped by the other players.
How do you know that's what it's meant for? Can I get a source for that, please?
People misusing the bubble to either get out of playing the game or make an alternate way of ending the level doesn't change that.
We can argue who exactly is responsible for a mechanic in a video game being used, don't get me wrong. However, fundamentally, that does not escape the criticism towards the mechanic being in the game to begin with. That is the problem here. You're asking, what if it's the other player's fault? And I'm not even unwilling to entertain that possibility. However, when we are discussing the fact that this was even put into the game in the first place, it needs to be kept in mind that they didn't get this ability through hacking it. Let me give you an example from the gaming realm. Battletoads on the NES has a two-player mode that not only is cooperative play, but also allows you to harm the other player. This fact was taken to task in the AVGN episode on it because the nerd and the guitar guy, who was playing the game with him, both ended up doing so accidentally.
Dragon, hit him! What the hell? I didn't know I could hit you. Get the pig, knock him off. Hey, you killed me! Sorry. Oh, get the bird.
I'm trying.
Oh, you fucker.
I didn't mean to do it.
That's really a problem. You shouldn't be able to hit each other. That's fucking bullshit! Okay, so we can't hit each other. You take the right and I take the left.
Okay.
What the hell was that? I said
I
stay
couldn't
to
help
the right.
it. The stupid wrecking ball thing just keeps swinging side to side.
Oops, I didn't mean that.
You see?
Why have an attack like that in a game where you can harm the other player? Ah, fuck!
How are we supposed to work as a team when you keep killing me?
Even if we argue that it is the player's fault fundamentally something like that happened, the nerd does ask a valid question. Why are these mechanics even in the game to begin with?
Takes away any risk how exactly?
Gee, how would having a second player essentially remove one of the main forms of obstacles in the game make the game easier? I wonder.
Ah yes, and you're doing such a fantastic job at cutting someone off before they can finish their point, which is ironic given your point against Key. You quite literally said,
The fact he cuts off Copycat here and starts arguing as if Copycat had finished his point when, no, he just hadn't, honestly makes it sound like he's not paying attention to the video he's commentating on.
and yet you interrupted Key while he was in the middle of his point. Just saying, if you're gonna get onto Key for cutting Copycat off before he can finish his arguments, then that standard applies to you too.
Okay, here's the fundamental difference. When I was criticizing Key for it, it was because his response had an obvious rebuttal that Copycat went on to say after Key interjected.
Their structure is still very straightforward considering it's just a pathway to the goal, and that's not even taking in the auto-scrolling levels which are in both of these games. And if this is about the collectibles, then you might have a point, but 1, you're really vague on this aspect, and 2, that's not really a fault with the game as opposed to the people you're playing with, which can be solved by simply asking the players to stop moving ahead so you could get whatever collectible you were trying to get.
I guess, but Copycat's issue is more how the game seems to be designed specifically so the players troll each other instead of working together. Which, by the way, he says directly after the part that Keyblade Master cut away from.
The chaos that's caused from this can be fun, but it does greatly diminish the point of co-op play, as it becomes more entertaining to troll your party rather than to help them.
Now, to be fair, Keyblade does include that clip slightly later in the video, and we will get to that, but the fact that he cuts off Copycat here and starts arguing as if Copycat had finished his point when, no, he just hadn't, honestly makes it sound like he's not paying attention to the video he's commentating on.
The issue wasn't merely that Key cut off Copycat before he finished his statement, so much as that Key was treating it like Copycat had finished discussing the topic, hence his inclusion of a point that was debunked by the next thing Copycat said. Key's next comment wasn't him, for example, saying the second player can't kill enemies. Instead, it was other ways there were challenges in Mario games.
Considering, unlike in the previous games you talked about, the second player here really can't do much aside from finding secrets with their specific ability, collecting coins, or taking out enemies. Stuff that, while helpful to the first player, isn't exactly game-breaking, thus leaving room for challenge. Especially when said challenge in Mario games comes from the platforming and obstacles.
Which I responded to through reasserting my original point that Key was attempting to deny something this obvious.
Obstacles that the second player has the ability to remove. Do you know what an obstacle is exactly? It's just something that gets in the way of progress. The enemies in Mario games being an example of this. If the second player can take out enemies, they have the ability to remove obstacles by definition.
But I'm not treating it like Key finished his point though. I haven't really argued against anything. The most I've done is say I think his question has a rather obvious answer to it given the context around it.
Key was bringing up that all the second player is able to do in these new games, as explained in the part you cut out, was finding secrets with a specific ability, collecting coins, or taking out enemies. These things don't necessarily take away the risk, especially if the AI-controlled characters are as useless as what I just demonstrated in my interjection.
Nina, they aren't AI-controlled. Another human being is controlling them.
Oh, you mean like the new Super Mario Bros. Games in 3D World, which were highly praised for its multiplayer?
So I decided to go to that Wikipedia page so I could actually read what Keyblade Master put on screen, and here's a quote that I thought was a little interesting. Brett Elston of Game Radar Plus, highly critical of the 4-player multiplayer, called it frustrating and stated it felt cramped due to several characters and small screen sizes, while advising that the game was best experienced with only 2 players. You know exactly what Copycat was saying?
Okay, let me see if I understand this correctly. So because one Games Radar Plus member did not like the multiplayer, it means the source key cited goes around him. If so, do you not realize how cherry-picking this is?
Okay, then show me some counterexamples. Well, Nina does do that while responding to one of my comments left on the script. So I'll just skip to that real quick.
Shout out to Sword Zenny for pointing this out while checking the script, but Henry Gilbert from Games Radar praised 3D World from its improved multiplayer.
Yeah, and that review in particular also savaged the previous game's multiplayer. Here's what it said. But Mario's new approach to multiplayer is the polar opposite of disappointing, because it finally has co-op platforming that actually works. The new Super Mario Bros. Games had wide open stages that could make for frantic, shallow fun, but 3D World proves that the third dimension was always missing from the equation. Now everyone has space to maneuver, be they the hardcore older brother or the confused great aunt. So good times can be had by all. Additionally, Mario, Luigi, Toad, and Peach all possess a unique playstyle that makes players feel more invested in their character of choice. It creates such quality couch multiplayer that most won't notice the lack of any online support. Essentially, although there is a fun chaos that can result from the multiplayer experience in the new Super Mario Bros. Games, at least specifically in New Super Mario Bros. Wii and Wii U, it's still not good as multiplayer. At least assuming the goal of multiplayer is to have people work together in order to overcome the challenges present in the game. This is essentially what Copycat said.
And Mike Splechta from GameZone said the game had an unobstructive multiplayer component. And while that doesn't exactly entail praise on its own, it's not negative either, especially when Mike gave high marks for everything else about the game even with multiplayer in mind.
Yeah, and again, that was while making it very clear the previous multiplayer experiences the Mario series provided had been bad. To quote directly from that review, "Had this been yet another 2D Mario game, I'd say don't the multiplayer. Like, don't even hover over it on the main menu. Multiplayer on Mario games has amounted to nothing more than a push fest, and what is supposed to be a fun, albeit lightly competitive game becomes a nightmare of cheap deaths." Super Mario 3D World is actually nothing like that. Since players are no longer confined to a 2D space, it actually makes exploring each level with friends that much more enjoyable. Key was talking about both New Super Mario Bros. Wii and Super Mario 3D World. So even if you have examples of people praising 3D World's multiplayer, that doesn't inherently back up what he was saying, unless they're also praising New Super Mario Bros. Wii's multiplayer. Every single review has made it clear 3D World's multiplayer being good is because it didn't feel like New Super Mario Bros. Wii's. Therefore, they're agreeing with what I quoted.
Okay, let me see if I heard this correctly. So the worst part about the Metroid franchise is the lack of console Prime games, which there are a couple of problems with this, considering that the Prime games are kinda a subgenre in the franchise.
No, they aren't. They're more along the lines of a spin-off series, similar to, say, Paper Mario.
This is severely pedantic and amounts to almost nothing. Okay, so, the definition of subgenre is described as a genre that is part of a larger genre, while a spin-off is described as something that is imitative or derivative of an earlier work, product, or establishment. Both words can convey the idea that they're spin-off titles in their respective franchises.
Maybe, but it's still more accurate to call it a spin-off, and if you're really just going to use a different term in order to communicate the same thing, there's not really a reason to not just say the most appropriate one for that situation.
Speaking of the main series, however, wouldn't the lack of any Metroid game being released be a far worse issue with the franchise than the lack of Prime games, considering the numerous game gaps within the franchise, which was at its worst during the 2010s, where only 3 Metroid games were released during that time, with one being a spin-off and another being Metroid Other M. We don't need to discuss how much of a train wreck that game is.
I see your point, but this is an issue that has long been solved. Since the release of Metroid Prime Federation Force in 2016, there have been 3 Metroid games in the past 6 years, or an average of 1 every other year. Metroid Dread released mere months before this video came out, for the record. Why would Copycat complain about a problem that has essentially already been solved?
Just because one mainline Metroid game was released during this time, it doesn't mean that the issue with the lack of Metroid games suddenly goes away.
Maybe it does to Copycat, and given it's his video, he has the ability to determine whatever he wants to be the worst thing about a franchise. He could feel this has been solved and therefore is not worth complaining about. You ignore that possibility, however, in order to make your argument.
Especially when you consider the fact that for a good number of years, Metroid fans got little to nothing in terms of content from the franchise. Heck, let's take a look at your example. Metroid Dread came out in 2021, literally 1 year into 2020, whereas Key's point of contention was during the 2010s where Other M, Federation Force, and a remake of Samus Returns were the only games they got, and for the rest of the decade, it was nothing but sheer neglect.
But the video didn't come out in the 2010s, it came out in the 2020s, when Metroid games were being released again. However, Prime games on home consoles weren't.
Not to mention this issue is widely talked about in the Metroid franchise rather than the lack of Prime games like Copycat assumes.
Where die-hard fans will agree with me that the worst thing about the series has to be the fact that there's been such an enormous gap between home console Prime entries.
Do you have any evidence to back up your claim? I'll grant you that Copycat also should have provided proof for his notion that hardcore fans agree with him. However, fundamentally, you still didn't give me any reason to believe you were telling the truth either.
Not gonna lie, you had me at the first part. Since yes, not being able to see where you go is a problem with these Fog of War maps. Granted, there are workarounds to getting better vision in these maps, like torches and in some games spells that increase visibility, but that wouldn't negate how this is still an issue.
Okay, full disclosure, I know basically nothing about Fire Emblem, so maybe this interjection would make more sense if I did, but I'm not even entirely sure what he's going for. So we'll ignore the fact that you began this interjection by threatening to treat your commentary target like the looting it started. That's just being thrown to the wayside now. You've changed your mind on that, I guess.
Wait, so you bring up that Key was joking with the whole threat thing, only to dismiss it in this interjection and act as if he was serious here. I guess Livy is not the only one who hates John's capitalism. Honestly, I'm more confused about how this joke was poor, since the root of the joke is him making a threat that if Copycat said something wrong about Fire Emblem then he would shoot him. After Copycat explains his point, Key would respond properly. Copycat had something going for his segment but squandered it, so I don't see how this joke was too confusing.
My problem was with the jarring tonal shift. Key directly went from going,
"Tread very lightly or you'll be coming out of this segment in pieces,"
which, by the way, made absolutely no reference to Copycat keeping his claims factually accurate. That is just something you added. And that inherently is going to create the impression that he is going to respond angrily to what Copycat says next. Which makes the fact that he goes on to argue Copycat in a calm manner rather strange, truth be told.
So your point is you agree with him, but there are ways to minimize it, which, side note, I don't know if that was supposed to be a debunking or an elaboration or whatever it was, but you still agree with him. This is made even more confusing by your next point, which, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but to be blunt, I have no idea what you're going for here.
Ephraim, are we going to cut off Key before he can finish his point again?
Not gonna lie, you had me at the first part. Since yes, not being able to see where you go is a problem with these Fog of War maps, granted, there are workarounds to getting better vision in these maps, like torches and in some games spells that increase visibility, but that wouldn't negate how this is still an issue. Then you bring up the AI being random in these levels and this whole entry falls apart, just like my attempts at making hilarious and original content.
He was saying that Copycat had something going in his favor, but then he squandered it by bringing up something I'll get to in a second.
While also saying that Copycat's complaint could be minimized. Had Key just said he agreed with the opening point, what he'd been trying to do would have been communicated far better. Without it, you have this extra fact that's included for no clear reason, which was the crux of my actual problem.
Now before anyone here says anything, yes, I am aware Ephraim includes this part later on and we will get to that, but the fact that Ephraim cuts off Key here and starts arguing as if Key has already finished his point when...
No, he just hadn't, honestly makes it sound like he's not paying attention to the video he's commentating on.
Key did finish his point though. He moved on to a different thought after the part of the video I cut off. He started talking about something different Copycat said, therefore meaning he had completed the argument he was making in that part of the video.
However, to explain this whole Key disagrees with Copycat thing, he was only bringing up workarounds to the Fog of War maps as ways that Copycat could mitigate his issues with these maps. This isn't debunking his point, but more just providing general advice that can help in the future with these games.
in a video which primarily existed to debunk the claims Copycat was making, therefore meaning if he is saying something in this video that contradicts what Copycat says, it is assumed Key is attempting to use this information to debunk. If Key were saying this in, for example, a GameFAQs walkthrough, I wouldn't be having this confusion, because there, the surrounding context makes the intent perfectly clear.
You bring up the AI being random in these levels and this whole entry falls apart, just like my attempts at making hilarious and original content. Considering this issue isn't necessarily a problem exclusive to Fog of War.
When did he say it was exactly? He said this was part of what made Fog of War levels so annoying, but he never claimed they only happened in those levels.
Ephraim, Copycat literally says that the worst part about the Fog of War levels is the AI being random, to which he then segues into talking about why that is an issue solely within these levels.
What I hated the most about these levels was the AI, as they are incredibly unpredictable. So there would be playthroughs where you need to guide someone from point A to point B, and they die before you even reach them.
Where in that statement did he say that AI was only random in the Fog of War levels? He said the unpredictable AI made those levels worse. That could be true even if every other level in the game had random AI.
To give another example from the Sonic series, the game Shadow the Hedgehog has a particularly infamous mission where you have to hunt down all 35 artificial chaos. The mission is very commonly considered to be the worst in the game because of the fact that you have to hunt down every single artificial chaos. Artificial chaos are just an annoying enemy, and the stage this happens in, Lost Impact, is very non-linear. Now, imagine if somebody called this the worst thing about Shadow the Hedgehog, and someone else replied by pointing out that Shadow the Hedgehog has a number of missions where you cannot miss a single target. And this isn't even the only mission in a non-linear and confusing environment. Hell, it's not even the only level to take place on a space colony arc. Would that somehow make the mission better?
Ephraim, your hypothetical example does not work. Since you're bringing up someone calling one specific mission in Shadow the Hedgehog the worst thing about the game towards someone calling a type of the level the worst thing about the franchise because of something every level in that franchise has.
Yeah, I am. What exactly is the problem with that? My point still came across either way, and it's not as if this comparison is ignoring something critical, so what's the issue here?
And even then, the person in your hypothetical situation could still be at fault, as if they explained it like how Copycat did with this segment, then they would be harping on this mission for the reasons you listed but would not bring up how these issues are prevalent throughout the game, instead treating it like they're solely exclusive to that level alone rather than Shadow the Hedgehog being at its worst with those issues in that stage. TRDL, your example doesn't work as a gotcha moment, try again.
But Copycat didn't say it was exclusive to these stages. You keep adding that qualifier even though it was never in his original video.
Another reason why Kirby games have felt stale is because they stopped making spin-off titles that I always remember amounted to extremely fun gameplay. The last one of these was Kirby's Air Ride for the GameCube, which was a very underrated racing title that unfortunately was overshadowed by Mario Kart and F-Zero at the time.
Well, that's a fucking lie, considering Kirby's Air Ride wasn't the last Kirby spin-off. There's games like Kirby's Blowout Blast, Deity's Drum Dash Deluxe, the Kirby Fighter games, and much more. So for you to discard these games to peddle on about how Kirby doesn't make any spin-off games is incredibly dishonest on your end and hurts your credibility as the presenter.
Okay, well I will admit that Copycat isn't the best at wording in this instance. I can tell that what he said doesn't sound close to what you thought he said. He mentioned that Nintendo stopped producing Kirby spin-off games he had a fondness for, meaning, he was saying that Kirby Air Ride was the last spin-off game that he personally enjoyed. He never said that Air Ride was the last spin-off Nintendo made for the Kirby series in general, just that Air Ride was the last one he enjoyed. So bringing up that Air Ride wasn't the last Kirby spin-off doesn't do anything to Copycat's point since that's not what's being argued.
Except Copycat was also using this to explain why he felt the series had become stale and repetitive. Meaning the implication is clearly that there aren't any more spin-off games, which he says were fun to also explain why the series is becoming worse for not including them. He's not just saying the series is becoming stale because it doesn't have any good spin-offs. That wouldn't make any sense. Because something being bad is not the same as it being stale. Something can be non-stale and also not good after all.
Up next is the Wario franchise, where I'd have to say that the worst thing about it is its decrease in quality over the years. Not only because they haven't released a 2D game since Wario Land Shake It, but because the WarioWare minigame entries are starting to lose its appeal. I do get that Wario is already a weird enough character as it is, and there isn't enough appeal for him to star in a huge AAA game, and maybe Nintendo wants to focus more on fan favorites. There is at least a new game called WarioWare Get It Together for the Switch coming out very soon, and it could redeem the franchise, but only time will tell.
Alright, Copycat, you're getting cancelled. Since this entry is garbage, as starting off with the 2D Wario games, how does the lack of games count as a sign that the games are downgrading in quality? Since having a small amount of games being released doesn't automatically equate to a drop in quality.
Okay, you got his point totally backwards. He was saying the Wario series has moved away from full 2D games towards mini-games, therefore meaning the series as a whole has gotten worse. He never says the series got worse because of games that don't exist or whatever you think he said.
Then Copycat didn't convey that very well, since he just went ahead and just said, "There hasn't been a 2D Wario game since Wario Land Shake It, now let's talk about WarioWare." Yeah, Copycat, that's another issue I have with this video as well. The way you structured this segment made it come off as a lack of 2D Wario games equals a drop in quality. And if by any chance, that's not what you were saying, then the fault is still on you due to your wording being so poor that it sounded like a completely different argument than what you were intending here.
But that could very well be what he believes. In fact, that was the interpretation Keyblade Master had, which I was arguing against originally. Is there something wrong with that opinion?
I mean, if this franchise was losing its appeal, then why does WarioWare Get It Together exist?
Because enough people like the WarioWare series, or like the microgame genre, in order for Nintendo to make a profit. This doesn't mean that the games aren't losing their appeal necessarily, it just means there is still enough appeal to where a new Wario game will turn a profit at the end of the day.
Ephraim, you just defeated your own point about the WarioWare games losing their appeal by bringing up how there was enough attention towards the franchise that it made Nintendo release a new game within it. Which, by the way, was Key's point to begin with, that there was enough appeal towards this franchise in order to give it a new installment. Not just that, but by bringing that up, you're proving Key right, because that was part of his point. His point was that there was enough appeal towards this franchise in order to give it a new installment named WarioWare Get It Together, and you flat out proved that point by saying that. This is not a good thing when you're debating someone, mainly because you are giving the person you are debating leeway to win the argument.
Except you don't need to have an increase or consistent amount of appeal in order for a product to turn a profit. You just need to have enough people interested in it for said profit to exist. My point was that even if the Wario games were still making a profit at the end of the day, they could very well be making less of a profit than they previously were because they don't have the same appeal they once did. That's not conceding to Key's point because he's outright denying the possibility of this series losing its appeal as if that's inherently obvious.
But the release of a new game doesn't determine interest, the sales of the game does. To compare this to another medium, the mere release of something like The Adventures of Pluto Nash doesn't mean there is an interest in space comedy starring Eddie Murphy, given that film was a massive box office bomb.
While I can agree that the sales of the game can determine interest, there is an issue with that statement, that being that it doesn't always fully represent the potential audience or engagement levels for a game. Many other factors can influence sales, including market strategies, game quality, competitive offerings, and so much more. Stuff that gives a more accurate representation of a game's reception and audience engagement.
What do you mean by potential audience exactly? Literally speaking, every single member of the public is a potential member of an audience. However, that does not mean that every single person, even assuming something was marketed the absolute best, would enjoy any individual product. I also find your use of the phrase engagement to be worth noting, if only because it doesn't equal appeal either. If a game is niche but has a high engagement rate from those who played it, that could mean the game had mass appeal, or it could mean the people who seeked out such a game were going to enjoy it inherently, even if they are a small sliver of the population.
So this entry just boils down to, these games are too easy for me, therefore it's the worst thing about this franchise. First off, mind explaining how these games in this franchise are easy, considering what people find hard is subjective.
What people find hard is subjective?
Yes, it's a subjective thing that varies depending on the person and has no objective basis behind it.
Then, why do so many games have difficulty settings? How would you even calculate that if it were subjective?
When it comes to the difficulty of video games, it's not as objective as you think it is.
How objective do I think it is exactly? Because the point I'm making is that there is some underlying objective criteria for difficulty in, at the very least, some sense or another. and that it can't be boiled down to a statement as simplistic as what people find difficult is subjective, like Key said.
The difficulty is different from person to person based on their skills, which vary depending on genres.
Yeah, and the amount of skill a player needs to have in order to beat a game is something that can be quantifiably measured.
Also, to quote a friend of mine, your point about difficulty settings doesn't really do much to your point since the player's skill and the types of games someone is good at can play a role that would imply a level of subjectivity. Yes, the difficulty settings can alter the difficulty and can add things that are going to make things harder, but the hardest difficulty stuff either removes perks, makes enemies do more damage, or throws more in. For example, in Minecraft, you can have enemies that hurt you more, and zombies can take down your wooden doors, stuff that would naturally be harder. Point is, the difficulty settings can only do so much to make your point.
So some level of objectivity is going to play a role then. Nobody is going to come to the conclusion that the Yoshi games are harder than, say, the Kaizo Mario ROM hacks, because we can determine it takes more skills to beat the second one than the first one. Determining difficulty has been something gaming companies have been doing since the beginning, by the way. One of the most famous examples of this involving Super Mario Bros. 2. I'll just allow Some Call Me Johnny to explain.
So with the success of Super Mario Bros., a sequel was inevitably planned out. I mean, now that Nintendo had a winning formula, it was only natural to expand upon it and make it better. But at first, it wasn't seen like that. In 1986, 1 year after the release of the original Super Mario Bros., Japan saw the release of Super Mario Bros. 2 for the Famicom Disk System. When the game was ready for international release, Nintendo of America ultimately canceled the idea of this game coming to America as well as Europe. And why is that? Because the game was developed by Satan himself! I mean, holy shit! If there was an award for most obnoxious difficult spike in a sequel, this game would win the award 3 years in a row! The wind, the obstacles, the level design, oh, the level design, it all screams hell!
The reason why Super Mario Bros. 2 Lost Levels was not given to American audiences originally was because of its difficulty. Howard Phillips directly said, "As I continued to play, I found that Super Mario Bros. 2 asked me again and again to take a leap of faith, and each of those leaps resulted in my immediate death. This was not a fun game to play. It was punishment. Undeserved punishment. I put down my controller, astonished that Mr. Miyamoto had chosen to design such a painful game." So Nintendo of America took the game Doki Doki Panic and reskinned it so it was a Mario game, because they determined that game to be objectively easier than the version of Mario 2 that was released in Japan. How would such a thing even be conceivable if difficulty was a subjective concept?
So while you might see them as easy, someone else can see them as hard.
Yeah, someone who hasn't played very many video games and might want to be introduced to the medium, which Copycat specifically acknowledged was possible.
Where it almost seems like Nintendo is intentionally producing them for kids as a stepping stone to other franchises.
Never mind how people can just be bad at the genre, or prefer other genres.
What does preference have to do with difficulty? It's not as if something is easier for you video game-wise the more you like it. If that were the case, why would anyone ever criticize a game for being too easy? Like these clips see people doing regarding Felix the Cat on NES.
The game's fairly easy. I beat it the first time I played it, and after you get the strongest power-up, any other heart you get after that will just become a 1-up. You collect those so rapidly, it makes the game hard to lose. And on some levels, you can just fly right over everything. Kind of like certain stages in Super Mario World where you can just use the cape to fly above the level. So that's my only minor complaint. It is a little too easy. It could have used a difficulty setting. But other than that, it's a lot of fun.
Really, with all the transformations and such, Felix the Cat is a really enjoyable game. It's just really easy. Later in the game, you're gonna get bombarded by sea urchins, and chances are you're gonna die once or twice. Oh, too hard for your weenie ass? Well, if you're smart enough, you can just float underneath all that troublesome crap.
Never mind how Yoshi is not the only true video game. Your example doesn't work, since Copycat specifically said that he felt like Nintendo was making the Yoshi games for kids.
And the reason he felt this was because of how easy they were. Therefore, he's calling the games incredibly easy for him, an experienced gamer. However, he does acknowledge it is possible younger players with less experience would find these games more difficult.
Also, are you seriously trying to say that the people who find something hard are somehow the same people who are new to video games?
No, I was clarifying after Key misunderstood that Copycat was saying finding these specific games difficult was a sign of being new at video games. I wasn't making any judgment in that statement. All I did was explain Copycat's point.
Next up, we're going to look at the massively popular Pokemon franchise, where I'd have to say that the worst thing about it has to be the steady decrease in difficulty that can be seen in its newer titles. This was pretty much the main complaint of their most recent Pokemon Sword and Shield entries, as there never really was a point in the game where you felt like you were in trouble, especially as the XP share works almost too well in leveling up your entire party at once. This causes you to be several levels higher than every opponent you come across, and just makes what should at least be a bit of a challenge incredibly easy.
Okay, so shout out to Toganium for pointing this out, since I'm not too familiar with the Pokemon series, but challenge runs have become incredibly popular as of late, so I don't necessarily see the lack of difficulty point as a big deal since you could always do a challenge run such as a Nuzlocke to combat the difficulty.
I guess, but at that point you're saying the game becomes harder if the player imposes restrictions on themselves that the game does not require them to, which, I mean, I guess, yeah, but that doesn't defeat the overall criticism that the game as sold is too easy.
Also, saying that you're always several levels higher is completely subjective since not everyone will have that experience with Sword and Shield, so this comes off as you trying to speak for everyone, with you saying, "You're always several levels higher," instead of saying, "I am always several levels high," like you did in the Yoshi segment.
How do you know that? Genuinely, you give me no reason to believe this is the result of how Copycat in particular played the game, over just how its fundamental infrastructure functions. Was Copycat playing in such a way a typical player wouldn't? If so, how do you know that? What was he doing? How did that result in him having a higher level? I am forced to wonder a lot of information regarding your point because of how underexplained it is.
If I had to nitpick a bit, then I would have to say that at times the controls in Luigi's Mansion 3 can be a bit weird. Throughout certain sections of the game, I remember getting extremely frustrated as I'd almost lose control of Luigi, causing me to take damage that should have been avoidable.
As someone who's played and beaten Luigi's Mansion 3, I don't see where you're coming from with this whole weird control thing. From watching numerous reviews of the game, nowhere were the controls listed as a problem. And in the clips where you show Luigi getting hurt, that's not really the fault of the controls, but more so the fault of the player, since the Kamek Goes' slam move can easily be dodged by a simple airburst or a simpler moving away considering the amount of space in the room.
Yeah, that's great and all, but what if he finds those awkward to do in this situation? Hell, actually looking at Copycat's footage, it's clear that he's trying to move out of the way, but can't, albeit it appears to be because of how slow Luigi is as opposed to an issue with the controls.
Throughout certain sections of the game, I remember getting
Are you sure about that? Because looking at the footage, we see Luigi walking backward while trying to vacuum air particles before not realizing that he should have either air burst by pressing the L and R buttons at the same time or simply moving away. Stuff that has less to do with the controls and more to do with Copycat not being aware of his surroundings and blaming the controls for his carelessness.
You have absolutely no way of knowing that, and going back to the question I asked Key, how do you know Copycat doesn't find those things awkward to do?
Also, are you literally trying to say that moving the left analog stick is awkward to do?
I mean, maybe. How exactly does playing with a Nintendo Switch controller feel? Because I can think of at least a few examples where a particular controller made playing games awkward or in some way more difficult than they needed to be.
But when I got to the overhead Robin stages, I finally figured out what the problem is with the controls. Say that I'm pushing right and then I shift my thumb over to move upward, the controller screws up to think that I'm still moving right. The construction on this controller is so cheap that if I don't take my thumb completely off the D-pad, the controller will keep reading the first direction that was pushed. So that's why overhead perspective games are playing like ass.
Okay, there. That's a perfect example of not only this game's extremely slippery controls, but the bad quality of the D-pad on the Genesis controller.
Yeah, I'm going there. I hate this friggin' thing.
I was pressing up on the D-pad so that I would grab onto the rope so that I could climb across. And boom! The D-pad is so sensitive that apparently I pressed it a bit to the left, and because of how slippery and fast this kid is, he immediately turned around and ran off to the left, straight into the pirate, and I died.
This game has terrible controls, but I think that was probably a given. What's even worse is that not only do the controls suck, the controller sucks. Well, at least mine does anyway. Despite there being 3 buttons, somebody decided that it was a good idea to make up on the control pad be the jump button. Fine, I can deal with it. But I can't deal with it when the control pad freaking sticks so much. Seriously, I'm not even pressing anything here. The controller is just stuck. It's so freaking frustrating that I might even say.
And as for the 2 portions, it's just using the L button to blow in the direction that you want to go to, which while isn't easy to understand at first, it's not necessarily a problem worth calling the worst part of the franchise.
Okay, then what is exactly? You've done this a few times throughout the video, just simply saying that what Copycat brings up isn't worth calling the worst thing about the franchise. Well, what criteria are you using to judge this? What would be an acceptable thing to call the worst part of a franchise exactly?
Key quite literally answered this question in the next interjection coming up.
Would you look at the time? It's now later. You're calling a nitpick in the 3rd game of a trilogy the worst thing about the franchise, when the earlier entries have issues that could be applied to a good number of games in those franchises. I know you said you would be nitpicking for some of the entries, but if your nitpicks are so inconsequential to the franchise you're talking about, then it would have been best to just not talk about those franchises instead of trying to find something to make a big stink over.
Ephraim, you're getting onto Key for cutting Copycat off before he can finish his arguments, and then you do the same thing here and cut Key off before he can finish his point. This is significantly more annoying since, spoilers, you don't play that part and instead end your commentary here, leading to this unfortunate moment of this argument destroying your own point. In other words, the very thing you got onto Key's case for why it's a bad thing.
And for the record, this clip is not played by Key at any point in the commentary. This isn't like the Mario example from earlier, where he just cut an argument off that was only halfway through and treated it like it was completely finished. No, now he's just cutting out essential context to the argument in question.
But Key had finished his interjection. He then went on to somewhat elaborate on this. However, as I mentioned in my interjection, this was not the first time he made this argument, and up until that point, it had not been adequately explained. Also, that wasn't Key giving any sort of criteria for what he believes should be considered the worst of a franchise. At absolute most, it was him expressing confusion over Copycat making something so inconsequential, in his view at least, in one game. Not because he had any issue with doing so inherently, but instead due to the fact that Copycat had previously listed criticisms that span over the course of multiple games. That wasn't Key explaining his own view on what should and should not count for this list. It's him expressing confusion over copycats. And that is a different topic entirely.
Citation needed, along with how you're calling a spin-off that by your own words isn't reflective of what the franchise is, the worst thing about the franchise. Do I even need to explain what is wrong with this segment? As it should be pretty obvious that calling a spin-off game the worst thing in the franchise, when it doesn't even try to reflect the franchise that are real-time strategy / puzzle games, and instead be its own thing with Pikmin attached to it, is a really dumb point.
Key, I'll just make it brief and short. The game is still a part of the Pikmin franchise and one that has been criticized the most.
Can I get a source for that or something along those lines? You just got on to Copycat for not providing proper citation regarding the claim this very Pikmin game was criticized.
Plus, it's your video. You don't need to go off of the mediocre reviews of Hey Pikmin. On that note, you didn't even show the mediocre reviews in your video, so it makes me wonder if that's what they actually said or if your source is just, dude, just trust me.
So I think it's only fair we expect some kind of evidence regarding claims you make, specifically in reference to the same franchise. My final thoughts are that this commentary is very long, and I have some unfinished business elsewhere that I am going to get to soon. Good night, and good luck.